Chapter 24. At Bay. The king was not traveling fast. He despised as well as hated the yowling dogs. It was the men only he knew he must evade. Through the snow he went, searching for a place where it would be safe to take time to fight the pack. Watching him run away, the dogs thought he was afraid of them, and so grew bolder every minute. But the wolf suddenly sensed that the men were again near, and that he should put the ridge between him and them. At once he changed his direction and struggled straight up the snow-covered rock slide, and it was a struggle, for his injured leg was stiffening. Seeing him turn tail completely, the dogs nearly went wild with excitement, but clumsily fell all over each other in trying to climb too quickly. Only one reached the crest in time to see which direction the king had taken on the other side. That was Jim's cunning old husky, who had been given a place in the pack. This dog, so timid when alone, now led the others down the ridge and into the timber almost on top of the great wolf, who was nursing his leg and limping badly after the slippery climb. Jim's dog held back then, but a younger one dashed forward and threw himself on the black foe so grimly and silently forcing his way through the crusted snow. There was a tense moment as they met, then a roar and a clash of naked teeth. Before the others could rush in, the wolf was on his feet and limped away, while in the snow the young husky sat and howled with surprise and pain, for in that moment the black had slashed his cheek. This disconcerted the other dogs, but down to the tall willows they followed, then along a frozen stream bed, then again into the willows on a narrow pathway made by moose. One of the big hoofed animals had turned from the path and made a trail of his own back over the ridge by way of the narrow valley. The wolf passed this turn, then suddenly changed his mind and returned to it. He followed the single track into the little valley, across the ridge and then down toward the river, where it joined the main trail of the moose leading across the muskegs and natural pastures to the shadow of Round Top Mountain. The wolf was dragging one leg. Every few yards the dogs, crowding each other in the narrow trail behind him, would get too close, whereupon he would stop, turn like a flash of lightning, and with a snarl send them back on their haunches. They dared not to struggle through the snow to head him off, so they followed, always menacing while waiting for a good chance to surround him. And the king understood all this, but thought mostly of escaping the rifles that also were following. With the legs stiffening more and more, he knew that he should not again take to the deep snow. At all costs, he must follow the moose trails to make any speed and watch every inch of the way lest the hunters get a chance at him. He was in his old haunts, his favorite range whose hiding places he knew so well, but the worry of the many long days was telling on him now, and the wound was growing worse. It was in the clearing beyond Johnny's cabin that he suddenly found himself being headed back in a circle to the wood he had run from in the morning, the place where he had left his mate and where the valley had seemed full of men. The moose trail led there. Suddenly the huskies shied back. The king had made up his mind and spun around to face them. They barked excitedly, furiously, their hair on end and fangs exposed. They edged around the wolf. The big fight at last! But no, the king suddenly leapt into the snow and floundered back to Johnny's well-worn path that led from the cabin to the river for water. The dogs pressed him closely. He dared not risk the snow any further, and so followed Johnny's path. At the first bend he hesitated, for the scent of man was strong, but it was a friendly scent, belonging to the only human being he had no cause to fear. The pack once more spread out to surround him there in the open. He had to go on, or somehow reach the forest. He was looking around him, searching for a way out. His leg was useless now. It dragged like a dead weight. Then he made up his mind again, so quickly that it took the dogs by surprise. With something like the old fire, he dashed straight through the open door of the cabin and stood at bay inside. The fight that followed may well go down in history. Johnny saw all of it, for he was writing, propped up comfortably in the upper bunk, when wolf and dogs burst in and took possession of the shack as completely as if he did not exist. The wolf stood with his weak leg propped against the wall in the farthest corner of the room. He crouched slightly and laid back his ears until his head seemed all mouth and eyes. The 8 dogs formed in front of him in a wild mass, barking, yelping, and growling. Not a sound came from the king wolf as he waited. The dog mass surged forward and then back. It moved again, wavered, and broke, disgorging one snarling brown and white husky. Then the wolf sprang, and for an instant pandemonium broke loose. With big dogs all over him, the king never stopped, till he had taught the luckless ones a lesson. After that he broke into the air until his head was touching the ceiling, hurled 70-pound dogs this way and that, and then retired to his corner. From his high perch, Johnny watched, fascinated. The dogs edged back. They were mad now, reckless with the battle lust and taste of blood, but none cared to go in first. They were all panting. The air in the little one-room shack seemed gone, and in its place was rank odor. Then the black wolf crouched lower and charged the whole line. Dog after dog was hurled against the walls. Like bees, then they clambered over him and clung, blotted him out, smothered him, formed a solid mass which heaved and then turned inside out and burst all over the room as again by super effort he broke away, gasping, spitting hair, flashing fury from bloodshot eyes. Back once more in the corner he stood as before, but Johnny saw now that strange pucker, deep and heavy above his eyes. It meant that at last all the smoldering hatelet of the king was aroused. It meant that he would fight, not just to defend himself, but to kill, to exterminate this band of enemies. There was something so terrible in his look that Johnny instinctively pressed closer to the wall of logs at his back. The man was practically cornered by the fighters, but he would not have left the cabin now for anything. The dogs were getting up their courage for another attack, all but one which had crawled into a corner and another which had rushed yelping into the snow. Their best chance lay in breaking down the wolf by maiming one or more of its 3 remaining good legs, and they knew it. Jim's husky edged in from the left. Another big black and white dog challenged from the right. The 4 others held the wolf's attention in front, but suddenly the king seemed aware of his old enemy. He turned slightly to the left, and from that time scarcely ever took his eyes from Jim's dog. The husky slunk away and tried to hide among the others, but still those eyes followed him. Johnny started the next attack by clumsily knocking over a box of nails on a rafter. The sudden noise startled the wolf and made him look quickly in that direction. Instantly the dogs were upon him. He went down, overwhelmed by the mere weight of so many, and Johnny saw that he was on his back, thrusting and slashing, doing all that he could against the heavy odds. Then a dog whirled out of the battle and limped to the door. A second one spun about oddly and collapsed against the wall. A third rolled over and over, howling and trying in vain to get on his feet. Then the black wolf, now red from almost head to tail, staggered up and met the last 3 face to face. Now it was bite and slash and jump away. All were winded, panted for breath, steaming from the heat of the fighting. Johnny noticed that Jim's husky was constantly circling the floor, dodging twice as often as the others. Watching closely for a few minutes, he saw then that while the 2 other dogs were attacking and worrying the black giant whenever they had a chance, the wolf on 3 legs was actually following Jim's dog and trying to corner him. What prevented him was the agility of his enemies. The 2 brown and white huskies were trying to hamstring and cripple him. He had to keep constant guard against this, but between rushes he had always headed toward Jim's husky and waited for his chance. One of the dogs caught him by the flank and held on. He came around like lightning and slashed. With a howl, the dog let go and tumbled back, but his big comrade meanwhile dashed in and had the wolf by the throat, just as Jim's husky descended on him from the other side. The king reared and came down crashing, with the first dog underneath his full weight. Somehow, then he twisted his neck around until he brought his teeth to bear on the hard skull of the husky that was throttling him. The dog let go and scrambled from under, but he was not quite quick enough. The king, free again, slashed twice with all of his fury, then turned on Jim's dog, now the only one that remained. The latter sprang away. For a few moments the wolf crouched there catching his breath, then slowly, grimly moved toward his old enemy. Jim's husky suddenly saw his fate. He tried to edge toward the door, but was thwarted. He lost all his bravado, cringed and whimpered and slunk about with his tail between his legs, and still the wolf came on. Johnny suddenly realized that the impossible had happened. The big wolf had won against all the odds man could put against him, and now he was going to punish the dog he had reason to hate above all others. The man knew in his heart that had the fight gone against the king, he would not have allowed him to be murdered there before his eyes. Now he must save Jim's dog. A yell made the wolf glance in his direction, but only for a second. Then Johnny began to throw things. Anything he could lay his hands on, the pillow, a hairbrush, his shaving things. The black warrior hesitated and looked at him again as if accusing him and trying to understand. He stood there on 3 legs, almost tottering, bleeding in a dozen places, covered with dirt and foam. The victor, gazing at man and wondering why now he interfered. And for a moment Johnny felt mean, unfair, contemptible. Then the wolf turned his head toward the door, as if listening. His whole attitude changed, and the dog seemed forgotten. Cautiously, he moved to a point from which he could look down the valley without exposing himself to view. His head went up, and the hair bristled over his shoulders and along his spine. In another moment, he was gone. Johnny looked again to make sure. The wolf had moved quickly, and yet had seemed to glide or fade away. There had been no sound. Outside, the setting sun gleamed on the snow. The husky rushed out of the door. Voices sounded. Presently Steve, Harry Lightning, and Jones appeared in the path. In another minute, they were clustered in the doorway, looking at the wreckage on the floor of the cabin. Slowly, all eyes turned to Johnny, who still sat on the edge of the high bunk as if petrified. "What happened, and where is he?" snapped Steve. "Don't know where," answered Johnny, "but he's gone. He licked your pack right here where they drove him. And you sat there just cheering, I suppose?" Steve was fast losing his temper. "What kind of a ranger are you anyway? Enjoyed the fight, I guess, because that black butcher cleaned up the place with our dogs. Well, if Jim hadn't broken his leg in a fall on the other side, we'd have been here on time to spoil your party. Bah!" "Get out," said Johnny, and in his eyes when he said it was something of the look of the big black. Jones pushed in between them. "Come along," he begged. "Don't waste time here." Steve looked around the cabin once more, kicked a coat out of his way, and stalked out the door. "Sorry about all this," Jones said to Johnny in a lower voice. "Not much left of your things. Very sorry." Then he too was gone. Johnny heard their voices outside, snatches of talk. "Here's the trail. No, it's this way. Never mind that dog. Yes, over the ridge. Hurry along, the sun's nearly gone." Johnny let himself down from the bunk and began picking up scattered grocery cans. One had rolled into the snow. He retrieved it and stood there looking at the endless wooded valley and the giant rock piles above it, snow-covered and fast-growing gray. Each minute that went by without the sound of a gunshot meant hope for the wolf.